Last year, John Ridsdale and Robert Hall were killed at the hands of the terrorist group Abu Sayyaf. They had been held hostage for months, and given the government policy not to pay ransom or negotiate with terrorists, the two families had to try and figure out what to do themselves. They are now speaking out about some of what they went through and what they think should change as a result.
My name is Robert Hall. I'm a Canadian citizen.
My name is John Ridsdale. I'm also being held hostage by the Abu Sayyaf group.
It took months for the demand for ransom to finally come, $28 million per hostage. The answer John Ridsdale and Robert Hall's families got from the government was clear. It would not negotiate or pay ransom to terrorists. A longtime friend of John Ridsdale's, Bob Ray, was called in to help.
I think there were times when they felt that they were kind of, dancing in the dark.
The families traveled to the Philippines. They spoke to the hostage takers. They started to raise money. But they say they never felt they were getting enough information from the government. Robert Hall's sister says there was no real strategy.
There really seemed to be sort of lack of concern, bordering really close to apathy on the government's part.
A Canadian security consultant who was in the Philippines at the same time says a military operation was planned, but because the families and the Canadian government did not give a green light, it never went ahead.
This was a very radical, very dangerous Islamic terrorist group that were trying to prove that they were up to the standards of ISIL.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Canadian authorities were talking to the Philippine government. A senior source says all options, except a ransom payment, were on the table, but nothing could be done. Within months, both Hall and Ridsdale were killed, and the Prime Minister had to deliver the news.
Canada cannot and will not pay ransoms to terrorists. We will not turn the maple leaf worn with pride by over 3 million Canadians abroad into targets.
Now, the families support the government's no ransom policy, but both say more could have been done to help them navigate the unimaginable situation they found themselves in, and both hope the government will learn lessons from the tragic deaths of their family members. So where can families turn for support if indeed a loved one is kidnapped? Joining me now from New York, the founder of Hostage UK and Hostage US, Rachel Briggs. Nice to see you.
Hello.
You founded Hostage UK back in 2004. Why did you decide to do that? What were you looking to do to help?
A group of us got together to form Hostage UK because we could see that there was a real gap around the provision of services to the families of hostages during a kidnapping and then the family and the hostage on their return. Many of us had been through this, myself as a family member, others as hostages, and while focus rightly is on the return of that hostage, what we recognised was that there were many things that families needed to have access to while this ordeal was going on to help them survive the ordeal, and that indeed the return of a hostage is only the start of another challenge for that individual. So what we wanted to do was to create an organisation that could provide the full range of support and professional services to hostages and their families.
So is this sort of a charity that's been set up instead of families having to turn to private companies, K&R companies, or is that filling in that gap in a different kind of way?
Hostage UK and Hostage US are not involved in any way, shape or form in efforts to bring hostages home. So we don't negotiate, we don't advise families on how to negotiate, and we're not involved in any other attempts to retrieve hostages. What we recognise is that families need all sorts of support services just to survive getting through what is, as you can imagine, a very traumatic, a very trying experience, and also very many practical issues that come up for them. So we are not competing in any way with many of those K&R providers. What we're doing is offering a service which complements and which meets those very basic human needs.
So one of the things that we've heard in this particular case with John Ridsdale and Robert Hall was sort of a lack of information, or the family feeling a bit lost in terms of how do you figure out what to do, given that, who can imagine that this kind of thing will happen to you. Is that something that you have heard from other families, particularly in countries where the policy is not to pay ransom?
Well, naturally, you'll understand that I can't comment on these individual cases. So talking generically across our experience of working in a number of countries, the UK, the US, many European countries as well, what you find is that the information really is very sparse on the ground during kidnap cases. So there is in many cases, there is very little information to share at all. As you can imagine, for families, getting hold of every last piece of that information is incredibly important. Now, of course, there is a line in the sand over which a government cannot cross. They cannot reveal information which will put government operatives in danger, for example. What families usually don't want or need is access to highly classified intelligence. What they're trying to figure out is what on earth is going on. They need to be satisfied that the government or whoever is handling the negotiations is doing everything they possibly can, that they've exhausted all different avenues. They need to understand the shape of what is being done in effort to bring their loved ones home. So while they may not necessarily need the finer details of every last piece of intelligence, that sharing of information between government and family, that sharing of strategy is so important, not just to building trust between a family and a government, but also helping families to make sense of what's going on and reassure them that really everything is being done to get their loved one home safely.
And again, I understand you can only speak generally, but in a general way, are governments responsive to giving that kind of information to families?
I think that we've seen governments move a tremendous distance on this issue. You know, we can all understand why governments are nervous about sharing sensitive information outside of government circles. The message that we always give to the governments we work with is a really simple one, which is that the party that has the most interest in keeping this very sensitive information private is actually the family. And a family that understands the sensitivities around that information and how it is so crucial to getting their loved one back, in my experience, keep that information private. So we've seen governments travel a tremendous distance on this issue of sharing information with families, and when they do, our experience has been very positive of that.
Would you suggest, or would you say that an organization like yours needs to be established in Canada or in other countries in particular to sort of try and make up the gap there that exists for hostages and their families?
We would certainly be very keen to establish an organisation like ours in Canada, and I think a service like ours is needed really in any country that experiences hostage cases overseas of its nationals. When we set up Hostage UK back in 2004, we were the only organisation in the world doing this. Hostage US is now the second organisation. We know from our experience that families in other countries, including Canada, have reached out to us. We know there is a need, and we have managed to develop best practice over these last 12 years. So I think there is a need for something like us in Canada, and we would certainly be very interested in working to establish that.
Let me end on this. You know, this is one of these issues where no one ever thinks it's going to happen to them or to their families. So, you know, perhaps for that reason, the public pressure to get things to change is not as large as you would imagine, because no one thinks it's going to happen to them. What would you say to people about the danger and risk of these kinds of incidents in the world we live in now?
Well, if our caseload is anything to go by, the number of kidnaps is going up globally. Of course, many of these cases never see the light of day. They certainly don't make newspaper headlines. Our estimates are, for example, that there are 200 to 300 Americans kidnapped overseas each year. I think, you know, most people learning that for the first time would be very surprised. This is certainly not a large-scale global problem, but the numbers are much higher than we think. And actually, the impact on the human beings that have to go through this ordeal is so profound, can last in some cases literally for the rest of their lives. And ensuring that they have the quality of care, that they have the full range of support to get through it. And as one of our former hostages says, the support to survive survival is so important. And I hope we can be part of making that a reality in Canada as well.
Rachel Briggs, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can watch our full documentary, Kept in the Dark. That'll be on The National tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on CBC News Network and 10 p.m. on your local CBC station. You can also read the interactive version of this story at cbcnews.ca.